Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The town of Willow sat where the desert flattened and widened, a scattering of low buildings pressed against a two-lane highway that carried more dust than traffic. At dusk, the light drained slowly from the sky, turning the horizon the color of old copper. Wind moved without pattern, lifting grit from the shoulders of the road and setting it down again. Nothing in Willow felt temporary, yet nothing felt fully anchored. People passed through, rarely staying long, and those who remained learned to keep their lives narrow and visible. On a Tuesday in late October, the day cooled earlier than expected. The sun slipped behind the low hills before 5, leaving the town under a pale violet sky. The elementary school emptied, the grocery locked its doors, and the gas station lights flicked on with a faint electrical hum. Beyond the last buildings, the desert began immediately, without trees or fences, a wide open expanse that seemed to absorb sound and distance alike. Emily Carter left the school parking lot at 4:38. She taught 3rd grade, lived alone in a rented duplex near the edge of town, and followed the same routine most afternoons. She drove east for 3 blocks, turned onto Juniper Road, and reached her place within minutes. The route was so familiar it barely registered as movement. That evening, she planned to grade spelling tests and call her sister before dinner. Emily never arrived home. Her car was found just after midnight, angled awkwardly off the road a mile outside town. The driver's door stood open, its interior light draining the battery. The engine was cold. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no sign of impact. The keys were missing. So was Emily. The first person to notice something wrong was the night clerk at the gas station. He recognized Emily's car, a dull gray sedan that came through twice a week for fuel. When he closed at 11, he passed it on the highway shoulder, lights off, door ajar. He assumed a breakdown and thought little of it until the car was still there when the sheriff arrived an hour later. By morning, the road was blocked with yellow tape that fluttered uselessly in the wind. Willow woke slowly, as it always did, but the mood shifted once people understood why patrol trucks lined the highway. News traveled without effort. By noon, everyone knew Emily Carter had vanished, somewhere between the school and her front door. The initial assumption leaned toward a voluntary disappearance. Adults did not simply vanish from Willow, but they did leave. People grew tired of the desert, the isolation, the sameness of days. Yet the open car unsettled even the most skeptical. Emily was methodical, careful, known for planning weeks ahead. She did not abandon her vehicle on a cold roadside without reason. Deputies walked the area in widening circles, scanning the dirt for footprints, tire impressions, anything that broke the surface of the sand. The ground was uncooperative. Wind erased detail quickly, smoothing the desert like water over stone. What little remained suggested more than one set of tire tracks, some overlapping, some too faint to follow. Inside the car, everything appeared ordinary. Her bag lay on the passenger seat still zipped. Papers sat neatly in the console. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no scattered belongings. The absence itself felt deliberate, as if whatever had happened occurred quickly and cleanly. By afternoon, state investigators arrived, drawn by the emptiness of the scene rather than its chaos. They noted the location carefully. The stretch of highway was dark at night, unlit, and rarely traveled after sunset. Cell service faded in and out. Anyone stopping there would be isolated, unseen by passing traffic for long minutes at a time. Attention turned to Emily's routine. She left school at nearly the same time every day. She drove the same roads. She stopped occasionally at the gas station or the post office, rarely anywhere else. Predictability settled over her life like a pattern worn into the ground. Friends and coworkers described her as cautious, private, and steady. She did not date much. She kept her circle small. No recent conflicts surfaced. No debts. No sudden changes. No known threats. The absence of motive frustrated investigators, but it also sharpened their focus. Crimes without obvious cause often relied on opportunity. Search teams moved outward into the desert, tracing dry washes and shallow ravines where sound and sight disappeared. Helicopters skimmed low over the land, their shadows sliding across scrub and stone. Nothing appeared. No clothing, no disturbed earth, no indication that Emily had gone willingly or otherwise into the open desert. As daylight faded again, a different pattern emerged. Traffic cameras from neighboring counties showed a dark pickup traveling west through Willow shortly after 5. The vehicle did not belong to any local resident. Its plates were obscured by dust, but its timing aligned with Emily's disappearance. The truck did not stop in town. It slowed near Juniper Road, then accelerated toward the highway. Investigators returned to the car with renewed attention. They measured distances, angles, and lines of sight. From the driver's seat, the road curved gently, limiting visibility ahead. If another vehicle had stopped suddenly or appeared from a side road, Emily would have had little warning. The open door suggested she exited the car willingly, at least initially. That night, Willow felt smaller than it ever had. Porch lights stayed on. Doors were locked earlier than usual. Parents kept children indoors. The desert pressed close to the edges of town, silent and watchful. Somewhere beyond the reach of the streetlights, answers waited. But the first day ended without them, leaving only a cold car on the roadside, and the growing certainty that Emily Carter had not simply walked away. By the second morning, the certainty hardened into routine. Command posts were set up along the highway, folding tables weighted down with maps and coffee thermoses. Search grids were redrawn and reassigned. Deputies rotated through 12-hour shifts, their patrol trucks coated in dust that never fully washed off. The investigation shifted from reaction to structure, from shock to method. The state team began by reconstructing Emily Carter's final hour. Security footage from the school showed her leaving on time, alone, carrying a canvas tote heavy with papers. A traffic camera near the courthouse caught her sedan heading east minutes later. After that, there was nothing until the abandoned car. The space between those points became the focus, a narrow corridor of time and road where something precise and decisive had occurred. Investigators drove the route repeatedly, at different speeds, at different times of day. They noted where headlights disappeared into dips in the road, where shoulder space widened enough for a vehicle to pull alongside another. Juniper Road intersected the highway at a shallow angle, poorly lit and rarely used after dark. Tire impressions near that junction were faint but inconsistent, as if a heavier vehicle had slowed, adjusted, then moved on. The pickup truck seen on the camera footage became the central thread. Analysts enhanced the images frame by frame, isolating its shape and modifications. It was older, with a raised suspension and a toolbox mounted behind the cab. A distinctive dent marked the rear panel, subtle but consistent across multiple frames. The truck passed through Willow once and never returned, which suggested intention rather than coincidence. Lists were generated. Local owners of similar trucks were interviewed and cleared. Mechanics were asked about recent repairs matching the damage. Nothing connected. The truck was not registered in the county or any neighboring jurisdiction. It had come from farther away, passing through Willow as a means, not a destination. Attention turned to Emily herself. Her phone records showed no unusual calls or messages. Her email contained lesson plans and routine correspondence. There were no dating profiles, no online arguments, no evidence of someone tracking her digitally. Yet her predictability remained undeniable. She left work at the same time. She drove alone. She traveled a stretch of road where help was distant, and darkness arrived early. Search teams expanded beyond the immediate desert. Dry culverts beneath the highway were checked. Abandoned sheds and line shacks used by ranchers were entered and cleared. The land offered many places to hide something temporarily, fewer places to hide something permanently. Still, nothing surfaced. By the third day, tips began arriving from outside Willow. Truck drivers reported seeing a gray sedan stopped along the highway that evening, hazard lights flashing briefly before going dark. One recalled a pickup pulled in front of it, angled as if offering assistance. Another remembered headlights off in the distance, parked too cleanly to be broken down. Each account added shape, but not certainty. Investigators debated whether Emily had been targeted specifically or encountered someone by chance. The lack of violence at the scene suggested control rather than panic. There were no signs she had been forced from the car. The keys missing implied movement afterward, not abandonment. If she left the vehicle voluntarily, it was likely under the belief that she would return quickly. The possibility of impersonation was raised quietly. In rural areas, authority carried weight. A uniform, a light bar, even the suggestion of official business could compel compliance. No confirmed reports of false stops had been made in the region, but absence did not equate to safety. On the fourth evening, a break came from an unexpected direction. A wildlife camera placed near a ranch gate 20 miles west of Willow captured a pickup matching the suspect vehicle just after 6 on the night Emily vanished. The image was grainy but clear enough to show the toolbox and the rear panel dent. In the bed of the truck, partially obscured by shadow, was a pale shape that did not shift between frames. The road near the camera led toward a network of abandoned mining claims, land that changed hands decades ago and was rarely visited now. The area was a maze of dirt tracks, some leading nowhere, others looping back into the desert. It was a place where maps lost precision and landmarks repeated themselves. Search teams moved in before dawn. They followed tire tracks that faded and reappeared, sometimes doubling back, sometimes vanishing into hard-packed earth. Several sites showed recent disturbance, shallow scrapes where a vehicle had turned sharply or stopped briefly. One location contained a discarded length of nylon rope, cut cleanly at one end. It was not weathered. It had not been there long. For the first time, the investigation shifted tone. What had been treated as a disappearance began to align with abduction. The care taken at the roadside now felt intentional rather than fortunate. Whoever took Emily had planned enough to leave little behind and to move her far from the place she vanished. As night fell again over Willow, the search pushed deeper into the desert. The land offered no answers yet, only distance and silence. But the shape of the crime was emerging, and with it the sense that time mattered more than ever. The abandoned mining claims lay beyond the reach of routine patrols, a scatter of collapsed structures and shallow shafts carved into the land long before Willow existed. The roads that led there were unmarked and unreliable, thinning into tire ruts that drifted apart and rejoined without warning. Navigation depended less on signage than memory, and memory belonged to those who had reasons to return. Search teams moved carefully, aware that the ground itself posed hazards. Old shafts were sometimes covered with little more than rotting boards and sand. The desert concealed its dangers quietly. Each step was deliberate. Each sweep of a flashlight measured. Progress was slow, but the terrain demanded it. Near one of the claims, a low structure emerged from the darkness. It had once been a storage shed, its roof partially collapsed, its door hanging open on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. The floor bore fresh tire marks, compressed earth that had not yet loosened under the wind. Investigators noted the width and tread pattern, consistent with a lifted pickup. There was no sign of a struggle, no personal items, nothing to suggest prolonged occupancy. It felt like a stopping point rather than a destination. Farther along the track, they found evidence of planning. A cluster of footprints showed repeated movement between a vehicle and the edge of a dry wash. Drag marks scored the dirt briefly, then vanished where the ground hardened. The impressions suggested weight and resistance, but not chaos. Whatever had occurred had been managed, controlled, and brief. The nylon rope discovered earlier was tested and traced to a regional hardware chain with stores across 3 states. That detail alone offered little, but it reinforced the sense of forethought. This was not an act driven by sudden impulse. It required preparation, timing, and familiarity with isolation. Investigators expanded their scope beyond the desert. They examined missing persons reports in neighboring states, looking for patterns that echoed Emily Carter's disappearance. 2 cases surfaced that drew immediate attention. Both involved women stopped along rural highways at dusk. Both vehicles were found intact, doors open, keys missing. Neither woman had been recovered. At the time, the cases were treated separately, too distant geographically to be linked. Now, the similarities felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The pickup described in those cases matched the one captured near Willow. Older model. Toolbox. Rear panel damage. The vehicle had appeared briefly, then disappeared into regions where cameras thinned and records dissolved. It moved along corridors of low visibility, choosing roads that offered privacy rather than speed. As the picture sharpened, so did the urgency. If Emily had been taken by someone who had done this before, she was unlikely to be held nearby. Temporary locations suggested transit, not containment. The desert stops were staging points, places to adjust, to avoid attention, to ensure compliance before moving on. Attention turned to property records tied to the mining claims. Many were defunct, their owners long deceased or unreachable. One parcel, however, stood out. It had changed hands quietly 2 years earlier, purchased through an intermediary company, registered out of state. The land included a derelict processing building farther west, accessible only by a narrow track that did not appear on most maps. Aerial surveillance confirmed recent activity there. Vehicle tracks converged near the structure, and a generator had been run within the last week. Heat signatures detected residual warmth inside, despite the building's abandoned status. The location was remote, even by desert standards, shielded by low ridges and invisible from the nearest road. Tactical teams approached just before dawn. The building was empty when they entered. Inside, they found restraints bolted into concrete, clean and deliberate. A cot sat against the far wall, its fabric creased but bare. There were no personal belongings, no food, no waste. The space was designed for holding, not living, and not for long. The absence cut sharply. It meant Emily had been there. It also meant she was no longer there. For the first time, investigators confronted the possibility that they were following rather than catching. The offender was mobile, adaptive, and attentive to pressure. Each discovery arrived slightly too late, each location already abandoned. As the sun rose over the desert, casting long shadows across the processing building, the investigation reached a critical juncture. The pattern was clear now, the method unmistakable. What remained unknown was where the road ended, and whether they could reach it in time. The pattern that finally emerged did not point deeper into the desert, but outward, along its edges, where isolation met access. Analysts overlaid the known locations on freight routes, agricultural supply roads, and defunct airstrips left over from decades earlier. The suspect vehicle had avoided population centers, but it did not wander randomly. It followed a logic of movement that balanced privacy with mobility. That logic led investigators north. toward a stretch of land where ranching thinned and properties spread miles apart. One address appeared repeatedly in peripheral records, never central, never alarming. A modest parcel listed under a single owner, Thomas Hale, purchased 5 years earlier. Hale worked seasonally as an equipment transporter, moving machinery between states. His schedule was irregular, his routes flexible, his presence rarely questioned. Vehicle registration tied a pickup matching the suspect description to Hale. The dent on the rear panel appeared in an insurance claim filed 3 years earlier for minor damage sustained off-road. The claim had been settled without inspection. Surveillance placed the truck on highways corresponding to the earlier disappearances, always passing through, never stopping long enough to be noticed. Investigators moved quickly but quietly. Aerial observation confirmed activity at Hale's property, despite its appearance of abandonment. A barn behind the main structure showed recent tire tracks. Power usage spiked intermittently, consistent with generator use. The land itself offered cover, shallow gullies and low hills that shielded the buildings from view. When teams entered the property, they found Emily Carter alive inside a reinforced room beneath the barn. She was restrained but conscious, dehydrated and weak. She had been moved repeatedly, held briefly in different locations, each one designed to delay discovery rather than conceal permanently. Hale had relied on distance, timing, and the assumption that investigations fractured across jurisdictions. He was arrested without resistance at a supply stop 40 miles away, returning with fuel and water. In his vehicle were restraints, maps marked with handwritten notes, and a handheld radio tuned to local law enforcement frequencies. The method was clear in retrospect. He staged authority, used isolation to control encounters, and moved quickly before attention could converge. Hale confessed to abducting multiple women over several years, selecting locations where help was distant and compliance seemed safest. 2 of the earlier victims were later located at separate burial sites along remote corridors he had traveled repeatedly. Emily survived because pressure arrived sooner than he anticipated, and because his system, built on precision, left little margin for disruption. The case closed without ceremony. Emily was transported out of Willow under medical supervision, her recovery left to private care beyond the reach of the investigation. Hale was transferred into federal custody, his network of locations dismantled and cataloged. Willow returned to its routines within weeks. The highway remained. The desert remained. At dusk, the light still drained slowly from the sky, and the wind still moved without direction. The difference lay only in what was now understood about the space beyond the town, and how easily silence could be used by someone who knew how to travel through it. Now let's get into the next story for tonight. The town of Rayfield sat along the Massachusetts shoreline with the posture of a place that had learned to keep its head down. Fishing boats were pulled high onto gravel lots for the winter, their hulls chalked white by salt. The harbor water stayed dark even at midday, thick with tide and shadow. On the mornings that followed the first hard frost, the streets carried a quiet that felt intentional, as if sound itself had been rationed. It was in this quiet that Thomas Hale failed to appear. Hale was a reporter for a regional investigative outlet based inland, but he had been living out of a rented room above a bakery in Rayfield for 6 weeks. The arrangement had been informal and temporary. He paid cash at the start of each week and kept irregular hours, leaving before dawn some mornings and returning after midnight on others. He rarely spoke more than necessary. His presence was known, but not examined. In a town accustomed to seasonal workers, maritime contractors, and short-term renters, this did not attract attention. What distinguished Hale was not his behavior, but his focus. He had arrived in Rayfield with a narrow purpose that he never announced publicly. His editors knew only that he was pursuing a long-form investigation tied to municipal records and environmental oversight. He did not request a desk at the local paper, or attempt to embed himself in civic life. Instead, he worked from his room, from the public library, and from his car, which he parked in different locations each day along the waterfront and near the old industrial corridor west of town. Rayfield had once hosted a cluster of light manufacturing facilities near the mouth of the river that cut inland through wetlands and low forest. Most had shuttered decades earlier, leaving behind concrete pads, rusting storage tanks, and a tangle of property transfers that few residents could explain clearly. The land had been rezoned, subdivided, and sold repeatedly, its ownership fractured across shell companies and development trusts. On paper, it was dormant. In practice, it remained a source of quiet concern. Hale spent hours tracing these parcels. He photographed fence lines, drainage outlets, and warning signs that had faded to illegibility. He filed public records requests with state agencies, asking for inspection reports, violation notices, and correspondence dating back more than 20 years. Some requests were fulfilled slowly, others were delayed without explanation. Hale documented the gaps carefully. He was last seen on a Thursday evening in early November. The bakery owner recalled him descending the narrow stairs just after dusk, wearing a dark coat and carrying his backpack. He did not say where he was going. He rarely did. By the following morning, his room was untouched. His bed was made. His laptop sat closed on the desk. His phone was not there. At first, no one panicked. Hale was an adult with a flexible schedule and a history of traveling without notice. When he missed a scheduled check-in with his editor that afternoon, it was attributed to poor reception or simple oversight. When he failed to respond to emails by Saturday morning, concern began to take shape. By Sunday night, his editor contacted local authorities. The Rayfield Police Department opened a missing persons report with measured urgency. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle, no immediate threats on record. Hale had not withdrawn large sums of cash or purchased travel tickets. His car remained parked along a residential street near the harbor, its interior neat, its fuel tank half full. Inside the vehicle, officers found a notebook in the glove compartment. It contained site addresses, parcel numbers, and handwritten dates. Some entries were circled, others were crossed out. A few bore short annotations that referenced sample results and inspection codes, but without context. It was clear the notes were part of a larger body of work. Detectives contacted Hale's family in western Massachusetts. They confirmed that he had not been in touch. This was not unusual during reporting trips, but the duration was. They also shared that Hale had become increasingly guarded over the past year. He spoke less about his assignments and avoided specifics when pressed. He had not expressed fear, but he had expressed frustration with what he described as systemic obstruction. As the days passed, Rayfield began to notice. The bakery posted a handwritten note asking for information. The library staff reviewed security footage that showed Hale entering and leaving alone, often carrying folders thick with paper. A dockhand recalled seeing him photographing storm drains near the river mouth the week prior. None of these observations explained where he had gone or why he had not returned. State police were notified and began coordinating with local investigators. They mapped Hale's known movements using toll records, parking receipts, and traffic cameras. The pattern that emerged was tight and repetitive. He stayed close to Rayfield, circling between the harbor, the river corridor, and a cluster of abandoned properties west of town. He did not venture far inland during his stay. On the fifth day, divers conducted a brief search near the harbor. The water was cold and murky. Visibility was poor. Nothing surfaced. Behind the scenes, Hale's editor reviewed his recent submissions and drafts. One unfinished piece stood out. It referenced discrepancies between environmental remediation reports and recent soil testing conducted by a private lab. The language was careful but pointed. It suggested that contamination levels near Rayfield's riverfront had been underreported for years, potentially allowing redevelopment to proceed without full disclosure. The draft ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Investigators began requesting copies of Hale's records requests and correspondence. Some agencies responded quickly, others cited processing delays. A few claimed they had no record of his inquiries at all, despite confirmation emails in his inbox. By the end of the first week, Rayfield's quiet had shifted. Conversations lowered when police cars passed. Longtime residents began revisiting old rumors about dumping practices and sealed agreements made when factories closed. The river, already viewed with suspicion, took on a heavier presence, its surface smooth and unreadable, as it slipped past the abandoned lots. There was still no evidence of a crime. No witnesses reported confrontation. No physical trace pointed clearly toward accident or intent. Yet the absence itself had begun to feel structured, as if Hale had not simply vanished, but had been removed from the sequence of ordinary explanations. On the seventh night, state investigators authorized a broader review of land access records near the sites Hale had frequented most. One address appeared repeatedly in his notes, always circled, always dated. It belonged to a decommissioned pumping station at the edge of the wetlands, officially inactive and listed as secured. According to municipal logs, no one had entered the facility in years. That claim would not survive what came next. The pumping station sat at the end of a service road that no longer appeared on most digital maps. It branched off from a county route just beyond a curve where the wetlands widened and the trees thinned into scrub. The pavement cracked within the first 100 yards, then dissolved into gravel and mud. At the end stood a low concrete structure, windowless, its exterior stained by decades of runoff and lichen. A chain-link fence surrounded it, topped with rusted wire. The gate hung slightly ajar. State investigators reached the site on the 8th morning after Thomas Hale was reported missing. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs. The wetlands were quiet, except for the sound of water moving beneath a skin of ice. Nothing about the structure suggested recent use at first glance. The padlock on the gate was intact, though its hasp showed fresh scoring, as if it had been opened and resealed. Inside the fence, footprints pressed into the mud told a different story. They were recent, overlapping, and inconsistent in size. Some led to the service door on the east side of the building. Others disappeared into the reeds behind it, where the ground dropped toward the river. The service door was unlocked. Investigators entered cautiously, documenting everything in sequence. The interior smelled of damp concrete and old oil. Electrical panels lined one wall, their labels faded. In the center of the room sat a large metal housing where pumps had once drawn water from the wetlands and pushed it toward treatment facilities farther inland. The machinery had been stripped long ago, leaving only mounting brackets and exposed bolts. On the floor near the back wall, partially obscured by debris, lay a black nylon strap. It matched the type used on camera bags and backpacks. A forensic team bagged it and continued their sweep. In a side room, they found something more troubling. A portable work light stood on the floor, unplugged but clean. Nearby, a folding table had been set up, its surface marked with scratches and faint chemical residue. The arrangement was temporary and deliberate, not the product of vagrancy or vandalism. Someone had used the space recently and taken care to remove most traces. There was no sign of Thomas Hale. The discovery shifted the investigation. What had begun as a missing persons case now carried the weight of intent. The pumping station was not a place one stumbled into accidentally. It required knowledge of its location and confidence that it would remain undisturbed. Detectives returned to Hale's notes with renewed focus. The circled address corresponded to the pumping station parcel. The dates match days when he had been seen near the wetlands. One annotation referenced sample depths and an acronym used in groundwater testing. Another noted a variance number tied to a state-issued permit. The permit, investigators learned, allowed a private developer to conduct soil disturbance as part of a planned riverfront project. The developer had acquired several adjacent parcels over the previous 5 years through a network of limited liability companies. On paper, the project promised mixed-use buildings and public access. In practice, it required assurances that the land was safe. State environmental officials produced records showing that remediation had been conducted and approved. Contamination levels, according to those reports, fell within acceptable thresholds. The paperwork was orderly and complete. Hale's draft suggested otherwise. His editor provided investigators with access to his encrypted cloud storage. Much of it was incomplete, but a folder labeled by parcel number contained raw lab results from an independent testing facility. The results showed elevated levels of industrial solvents and heavy metals in soil samples taken near the pumping station and downstream along the riverbank. The dates aligned with Hale's presence in Rayfield. There was no indication that these results had been submitted to regulators. Investigators began interviewing officials involved in the permitting process. Most deferred to the documentation. A few acknowledged that oversight in the area had been historically fragmented. Responsibility had shifted between agencies over the years. Records were archived, migrated, and occasionally lost. None admitted to wrongdoing. Attention turned to the developer. The company's public-facing office was located 2 hours away. Its principals were experienced and well-connected, with a portfolio of projects across the region. They cooperated with inquiries, providing their own environmental assessments and contracts with remediation firms. They denied any knowledge of independent testing conducted on their properties. They stated that the pumping station was not part of their active holdings and had been secured against entry. When asked about recent access logs, they produced none. Back in Rayfield, the search expanded. K-9 units tracked scent from Hale's car toward the wetlands, but lost it near the water. Drones surveyed the riverbanks and marsh islands, capturing footage of mudflats and tangled brush. Nothing surfaced. The river moved steadily toward the sea, its current slow but relentless. As the investigation progressed, Hale's reporting trail began to show signs of pressure. Email correspondence revealed repeated follow-ups to agencies that went unanswered. One message, sent days before his disappearance, referenced a forthcoming publication timeline and requested confirmation of discrepancies. There was no reply. Phone records showed that Hale had received several calls from a prepaid number during his final week in Rayfield. The calls were brief and routed through towers near the wetlands. The number was no longer active. On the 12th day, a maintenance worker from a nearby wastewater facility came forward. He reported seeing a vehicle parked near the pumping station late at night the previous month. The vehicle was a light-colored pickup with out-of-state plates. He had not reported it at the time because contractors occasionally accessed the area without notice. He could not provide a plate number. Investigators canvassed traffic cameras along nearby routes. One camera captured a pickup matching the description entering the service road the night before Hale disappeared. Another showed it leaving several hours later. The plates were obscured by mud. The pumping station yielded no further physical evidence. The wetlands resisted excavation due to environmental protections and unstable ground. Each search required permits and careful planning, slowing progress. Public concern grew, though quietly. Rayfield did not host demonstrations or press conferences. Instead, residents spoke in lowered voices at the market and along the docks. The sense that something had been concealed for years began to harden into suspicion. For investigators, the case now hinged on motive and access. Hale had been close to publishing findings that challenged official records and threatened a lucrative development. He had been working alone in a place few people watched closely. Someone had known where he would be. What remained unclear was whether his disappearance had been intended as intimidation, containment, or something final. That answer lay somewhere between the pumping station and the river, in a sequence of events that had been carefully erased, but not entirely undone. By the third week, the investigation narrowed rather than expanded. The wetlands became the center of gravity, not because they offered answers, but because everything else led back to them. The river curved past Rayfield with a slow discipline, widening and narrowing as the tide asserted itself. Its banks were unstable, layered with silt and reed roots that concealed disturbances within days. Any event that occurred there would leave little behind. State police requested historical aerial imagery of the pumping station parcel and surrounding marshland. Comparing decades of photographs revealed subtle but telling changes. A service path that had been declared decommissioned showed signs of intermittent use. Tire tracks appeared in images taken years apart, faint but consistent. The land had never been as dormant as records suggested. Investigators traced those paths to a small contractor that specialized in environmental remediation and site preparation. The company had worked for multiple developers in the region, often as a subcontractor, often under short-term agreements. Its crews were accustomed to working odd hours and accessing restricted sites. Their logs showed work near Rayfield months earlier, though not at the pumping station itself. Financial records painted a more complicated picture. Payments routed through intermediary firms corresponded loosely with the periods Hale had flagged in his notes. The amounts were modest, structured to avoid scrutiny, but they suggested ongoing activity rather than a closed chapter. Attention returned to the independent lab results Hale had obtained. Investigators contacted the lab directly. The technicians confirmed the samples were legitimate and had been submitted anonymously. Payment had been made in cash through a courier service. The lab had flagged the results internally due to their severity, but without a client name or official request, there had been no mechanism to escalate them. The contamination levels indicated long-term industrial dumping, not residual traces. Solvents consistent with degreasing operations and metals associated with plating processes appeared in concentrations that should have triggered mandatory remediation years earlier. The pumping station area sat downstream from several former facilities, making it a natural collection point. If these findings became public, they would not only halt development, they would reopen questions about regulatory failure and potential criminal negligence. Investigators began to consider whether Hale had confronted someone directly. His phone records showed a single outgoing call on the afternoon before he disappeared, placed to a number associated with a property management firm tied to the developer. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. There was no follow-up. The timing mattered. Traffic camera analysis placed Hale's car parked near the harbor that evening, as expected. His phone last connected to a tower near the wetlands shortly after nightfall. After that, it went silent. A targeted search of the riverbed was authorized, focusing on a narrow stretch downstream from the pumping station where currents slowed and sediment accumulated. Divers worked methodically, guided by sonar and grid markers. The water was cold and opaque, the bottom uneven. On the fourth day of the search, they found a weighted tarp lodged against a submerged log. The tarp contained tools, gloves, and a damaged work light similar to the one found in the pumping station. There were no human remains. The items appeared deliberately discarded, their placement suggesting an attempt to sink evidence without certainty it would stay hidden. Forensic analysis revealed trace soil matching the pumping station interior and fibers consistent with a nylon strap. The absence of a body complicated matters but did not diminish the implication. Someone had prepared for containment and cleanup. Investigators expanded their scope to include private security contractors and remediation crews who had access to the area. One name surfaced repeatedly through scheduling overlaps and vehicle sightings. A site supervisor with experience in hazardous materials handling had been present in Rayfield during Hale's final week, though his company claimed he was assigned elsewhere. License plate readers eventually captured his pickup truck crossing state lines 2 days after Hale vanished. The vehicle had been cleaned professionally. Inside, forensic teams found no direct evidence linking it to the pumping station. What they did find were receipts for weighted tarps and industrial rope purchased weeks earlier. The case reached an inflection point without resolution. Prosecutors cautioned against premature charges. Without a body or a direct witness, the narrative remained circumstantial, however coherent it appeared. Meanwhile, Hale's editor prepared the unfinished investigation for publication, consulting legal counsel and law enforcement. The decision was not framed as leverage, but as preservation. The reporting stood on its own merits, even incomplete. When the piece ran, it did not name suspects. It outlined discrepancies, documented contamination, and detailed Hale's disappearance as part of an unresolved context. The response was immediate. State agencies announced reviews. Development plans were suspended. Records previously delayed were released in bulk. Within that flood of documents, investigators found what Hale had been seeking. An internal memo, buried among archived correspondence, acknowledged contamination levels above legal limits at the pumping station site and recommended further testing. The memo had never been acted upon. It had been quietly filed away after a change in administration. The motive crystallized. Hale had not stumbled into danger by accident. He had been approaching a conclusion that threatened to expose a long-managed omission. Whether his disappearance had been intended to silence him permanently or merely to stop him remained an open question. What investigators now understood was that the pumping station was not the end of the story. It was the point where multiple interests converged, where neglect became liability, and where a journalist had stepped too close to a truth that others had spent years keeping submerged. The final answers would come not from the river itself, but from the people who had learned to work around it, confident that its silence would endure. The break came quietly, without announcement or spectacle, through paperwork rather than patrol cars. It arrived as a sworn statement appended to a production of records that few expected to matter. A junior project manager at the remediation subcontractor requested counsel after reviewing the published investigation and recognizing details he had been instructed to ignore. His role had been administrative. He scheduled crews, coordinated access permissions, and processed invoices that passed through multiple entities before reaching his desk. He had not been present at the pumping station the night Thomas Hale disappeared, but he understood what that site represented. Under oath, he described a standing directive that applied to certain legacy parcels along the Rayfield River corridor. If independent testing surfaced, crews were to secure the area, assess exposure risk, and remove materials that could trigger regulatory review. This was framed as safety protocol, not concealment. Documentation was minimal by design. The pumping station, he said, was different. It sat at the convergence of several contaminated flows, a place where sediment accumulated and records contradicted one another. When Hale began taking samples there, word traveled quickly through informal channels. Contractors spoke to property managers. Property managers spoke to consultants. The concern was not exposure, but timing. A pending development depended on a clean certification that could not withstand scrutiny. On the afternoon before Hale vanished, the site supervisor who had drawn investigators' attention received instructions to meet someone at the pumping station after dark. The purpose, as relayed secondhand, was to retrieve unauthorized equipment and deter further access. No violence was discussed. The assumption was that Hale would be warned and delayed. The plan unraveled. According to the supervisor's eventual account, Hale arrived earlier than expected. He had entered the station alone, carrying sampling gear and documentation. The encounter that followed was brief and disordered. There was a struggle near the rear of the structure, where the floor sloped toward an old drainage channel. Hale fell, striking his head against exposed concrete. He did not regain consciousness. Panic replaced intent. The supervisor did not call for medical assistance. He believed, incorrectly, that involvement of emergency services would expose the broader operation. Instead, he contacted a consultant who had managed similar incidents in the past. Together, they decided to remove Hale from the site and stage the area to suggest abandonment rather than injury. They moved his body through the wetlands to the river under cover of night, using equipment already on hand. The weighted tarp was meant to ensure submersion. The current, however, carried Hale farther than anticipated. 2 weeks later, his body surfaced near the river mouth after a storm shifted the sediment. It was discovered by a lobsterman at first light and reported immediately. Identification was swift. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and subsequent drowning. The timeline aligned with the supervisor's statement and with Hale's last known movements. What had been missing was now present, and with it, legal clarity. Arrests followed within days. The site supervisor was charged with manslaughter, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The consultant faced charges related to obstruction and improper disposal of human remains. Additional indictments addressed falsified records, regulatory fraud, and failure to report hazardous conditions. No charges were brought against municipal officials, though several resigned during the subsequent inquiry. State agencies revised oversight protocols and reopened dormant files related to the Rayfield corridor. Development plans were formally terminated. Thomas Hale's investigation was published in full, posthumously credited, its findings validated by independent review. The contamination he documented required extensive remediation that would take years to complete. Rayfield returned to its quiet, though altered in ways that were not immediately visible. The pumping station was sealed and marked for demolition. The service road was blocked and allowed to erode back into the wetlands. The river continued its steady movement toward the sea, carrying less than it once had, revealing just enough to close the case. Now, let's get into the final story for tonight. The call came in just after 8 in the morning, the hour when routines were fully formed but not yet protected by momentum. A man had entered a small insurance office on the outskirts of town, produced a handgun, and locked the front door behind him. 4 employees were inside. No one had been hurt yet. The caller was one of the hostages, speaking quietly from a desk phone before the line went dead. The building sat alone at the edge of a commercial strip, a single-story rectangle of glass and beige siding surrounded by an empty parking lot. It had been built for convenience rather than security. Large windows faced the road. A rear exit opened onto a narrow service lane. Inside, the layout was open, cubicles arranged loosely around a central reception area. There were no safe rooms, no reinforced doors, no places designed to hold under pressure. Patrol units arrived within minutes and pulled back quickly, establishing distance rather than presence. Traffic was diverted. Employees from nearby businesses were moved out without explanation. The morning light reflected off the glass front of the office, making it difficult to see inside without moving closer than protocol allowed. The man inside identified himself through a call placed to emergency services 20 minutes after entry. He gave his first name only. He spoke calmly, without shouting, and made no immediate demands. He said he wanted to be heard. He said he had been ignored for too long. He confirmed that he was armed, and that the people inside would remain unharmed as long as no one attempted to intervene. Negotiators were brought in from the county unit. They parked out of sight and established a communication line through the office phone system. The man answered consistently. He did not ramble. He spoke in complete thoughts, explaining, that the office represented something that had been taken from him, something that could not be replaced. He did not threaten violence directly, but he made clear that time was not on anyone's side. Inside the building, the hostages were seated along one wall, instructed to remain still and visible from the front windows. They complied without resistance. The man moved intermittently, pacing, checking the locks, adjusting the blinds, so that visibility shifted unpredictably. He did not bind them. He did not take their phones. Control was maintained through proximity and certainty rather than restraint. Negotiators worked to slow the situation. They asked about his history, his expectations, his needs. He responded selectively. He described a sequence of administrative decisions, appeals denied, documents lost, outcomes finalized without explanation. He spoke about months of silence following years of effort. The insurance office had been the last place he could think of that still had a door he could walk through. As the morning progressed, one hostage began to show signs of distress. She was older than the others, breathing shallowly, hands trembling despite attempts to steady them. The man noticed and moved closer, crouching briefly, speaking to her in a way that suggested reassurance rather than intimidation. He asked one of the other hostages to fetch water from the break room and allowed it without escort. This detail was noted carefully by observers watching through narrow sight lines. The man was not detached. He was attentive. That made the situation more complex rather than less. By late morning, the perimeter had solidified. Tactical units staged several blocks away. A sniper position was identified but not activated. The windows offered too many angles, too much uncertainty. Any shot would risk hitting someone other than the intended target. The man placed another call. His tone had shifted slightly, less controlled, more compressed. He said he was tired of explaining. He asked whether anyone on the outside actually understood what he was saying. The negotiator responded with practiced empathy, reflecting language, acknowledging frustration, offering alternatives that did not involve harm. The man listened, then asked a question that had not been raised before. He asked whether anyone had checked the file. The negotiator did not know what file he meant. The man explained that his case had been misclassified years earlier, that a single entry had redirected responsibility and removed recourse. He named an internal reference number and insisted that someone on the outside retrieve it. He said that once it was read properly, the situation would resolve itself. Efforts were made to locate the reference. Calls were placed to regional offices. Records were requested. The process was slow, not because of resistance, but because of structure. The system the man was challenging did not move quickly under ideal conditions. Under duress, it moved even less so. Inside, tension increased. The man stopped pacing and sat down near the hostages, his back against a desk, the weapon resting in his lap. He watched the front windows rather than the people beside him. The hostages remained silent, uncertain whether quiet compliance or engagement was safer. At just after 1 in the afternoon, a loud noise echoed from the rear of the building. It was unintentional, the result of a delivery truck passing too close to a dumpster. Inside, the sound registered differently. The man stood abruptly, raising the weapon, scanning toward the back exit. One of the hostages flinched and began to cry quietly. The man turned, startled by the sound, and shouted for silence. His voice carried more force than before. He apologized almost immediately, but the apology did not undo the shift. Something had changed. The boundary he had maintained between control and escalation had thinned. Negotiators adjusted strategy, pressing for release of at least one hostage. The man refused. He said releasing someone would dilute the seriousness of the situation. He said he had already compromised enough by waiting. At 2:14, a gunshot was heard inside the building. It was a single discharge, followed by silence. No movement was visible from the front windows. The man did not answer when negotiators called back. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then, one of the hostages appeared in the front window, hands raised, face streaked with blood that was not her own. She pounded once against the glass before backing away. The standoff had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed. The response was immediate but measured, shaped by the understanding that speed now carried its own risks. Tactical units advanced to pre-planned positions, not to force entry, but to re-establish control of the perimeter. Medics staged closer than before. Negotiators attempted contact again, adjusting tone and pacing to account for what had clearly occurred inside. The woman who had appeared at the window was brought out through the front door moments later. She moved quickly, guided rather than carried, her hands shaking as she was transferred to medical staff. The blood on her face belonged to another hostage, a man in his early 30s who had been seated closest to the gunman. He had been struck at close range, the wound immediately fatal. Inside the office, 3 hostages remained alive. The gunman resumed communication after several minutes. His voice was altered, slower, stripped of the earlier effort to sound controlled. He did not attempt to justify the shooting. He described it as an outcome, rather than a choice, something that had occurred when pressure exceeded tolerance. He stated that the person who had been shot had moved suddenly, though subsequent investigation would show that movement had been minimal, an instinctive shift rather than a threat. Negotiators focused on containment. The priority shifted from resolution through understanding to resolution through preservation. The man was encouraged to separate himself physically from the remaining hostages. He resisted at first, then complied partially, positioning them behind a row of desks while he remained closer to the windows. The weapon stayed in his hand. Information from outside continued to develop. The file the man had referenced was located, not within the insurance office, but in a regional archive maintained by a third-party administrator. The misclassification he had described was real. Years earlier, a clerical error had routed his claim into a category that limited appeal options and transferred responsibility to an entity that no longer existed. Subsequent denials had been procedurally correct within that framework, but the framework itself was flawed. The discovery mattered, but it arrived too late to undo what had already happened. The man was informed that the error had been identified and that steps could be taken to address it. The information was delivered carefully, without promises or absolution. He listened. For a brief period, there was reason to believe the situation might de-escalate. His breathing slowed. He sat down again, leaning against the desk, the weapon resting loosely in his grip. Inside the office, the remaining hostages were in visible shock. One had not stopped crying. The other sat rigid, eyes fixed on the floor. The gunman watched them intermittently, his attention drifting between them and the windows. The structure of his resolve was no longer stable. The shooting had altered his own perception of control. Negotiators pressed again for release. This time, he agreed to let one person go. The younger of the 2 remaining hostages was directed toward the front door and allowed to leave without interference. He moved quickly, not looking back. 2 people remained inside with the gunman. What followed unfolded over the next 40 minutes, marked by uneven communication and long pauses. The man spoke less about his case and more about the sequence of events that had led him there. He described loss not only of financial security but of identity, of being reclassified and diminished by systems that did not recognize error once it had been entered. His focus shifted inward, away from the hostages as symbols and toward them as witnesses. At one point, he asked whether the person he had shot had a family. The question was noted but not answered directly. Providing that information would have escalated emotional volatility rather than resolved it. The final moments came without warning. The surveillance feed showed the man standing abruptly, turning toward the last remaining hostage and raising the weapon. Tactical units moved simultaneously, acting on a window of visibility that had not existed earlier. A single shot was fired from outside, entering through the front glass at an angle calculated to minimize risk. The man collapsed immediately. The hostage behind him was uninjured. When the building was secured, investigators moved in methodically. The scene was processed with the same care applied to any homicide, though its complexity demanded additional layers of documentation. The deceased gunman was identified within hours. His history aligned with what he had described: a prolonged dispute marked by administrative failure rather than malice. That context explained behavior, but did not mitigate outcome. The man he had killed during the standoff was named publicly the following day. He had worked at the office for less than a year, recently transferred from another branch. He had no involvement in the case that had precipitated the hostage situation. He had been present because it was his scheduled shift. The official report classified the death as homicide. Responsibility was assigned clearly. The corrective action taken by law enforcement was ruled justified under policy. The misclassification that had sparked the event was acknowledged in internal reviews but addressed separately, its correction framed as coincidental rather than causal. For the surviving hostages, recovery was uneven. Statements were taken, counseling offered, routines slowly rebuilt. The office never reopened. The building was sold months later, its interior remodeled to remove any trace of what had occurred there. The file that had been misclassified was corrected quietly. Compensation was issued posthumously to the gunman's estate, processed as an administrative resolution rather than a response to violence. The timing was noted by those involved, but never discussed publicly. The case closed with a sense of procedural completeness and emotional incompleteness. Every action could be explained. Every decision fit within established frameworks. What could not be reconciled was the sequence that had allowed a correctable error to progress into irreversible loss. The morning routines resumed elsewhere. Phones rang. Files were opened and closed. Systems continued to function as designed, efficient, and indifferent. The difference was measured not in policy, but in absence. One man had gone to work and not returned. Another had sought recognition and found consequence. Between them, a moment had collapsed into permanence, leaving behind a resolution that satisfied process but not memory.